Chip Farrar called me this week and he asked me to go to the hospital to anoint his mother-in-law, Grace Conant, who's quite ill. And just before he hung up, he said, "Oh, by the way, her first name is not Grace, it's Minerva." And when I got to the hospital, I discovered that her family calls her neither Minerva nor Grace. They call her Chicky. When I was ordained, I was given a new name, Father. But this was an external identity, and I hadn't yet learned to be generative and nurturing. Because I was still insecure in my new identity, I remember asking my mother if she could get my grandmother to stop calling me Joey. She couldn't. Jesus asked his disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" His identity comes from his relationships within the community. They see him as part of the prophetic tradition, Elijah, Jeremiah. Jesus himself uses the title Son of Man, which is a prophetic title from the book of Daniel. But it's Simon Peter who recognizes Jesus' Davidic lineage, that he is the promised one, the Son of God, the Messiah, the Christ. Any encounter with Christ changes us as well. So Jesus gives Simon a new name, Peter, Rock, inviting Peter to discover a new identity as the rock on which Jesus will build the church. In Matthew chapter 7, Jesus says, "Anyone then who hears these words of mine and acts on them will be like a wise man who built his house on rock." It seems that Jesus is that wise man. We might think of this rock as a sign of strength and stability. But if you remember in the parable of the sower that we read a couple of weeks ago, some of the seed fell on rocky ground. That's actually a pretty good picture of the disciples. The seed sprouts quickly, but since it has no roots, it quickly begins to wither and die. Notice that Jesus calls Simon the son of Jonah. Jonah was the one who went the other way when God sent him to preach to the Ninevites. He was swallowed up by a great fish and spent 3 days in the belly of the fish before he came sputtering up on the shores of Nineveh. Perhaps Peter has already had his Jonah moment when he attempted, as we heard a few weeks ago, to walk on water in response to Jesus' invitation. Remember, he lost faith and began to sink like a stone. And next Sunday, as the story continues, we find Peter trying to turn Jesus away from the road to Jerusalem. But Jesus turned and said to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me." So Peter has not yet learned to live this new identity. He has a rocky road to walk before he grows into his new name. We see this probably most clearly in the Gospel of John. In John's Gospel, Peter receives his new mission not before the Passion, as in Matthew's Gospel, but rather after the resurrection around a charcoal fire. Jesus asked Peter 3 times, "Do you love me?" This, of course, corresponds to the 3 times Peter denied Jesus around the charcoal fire in the courtyard of the high priest Caiaphas. And after each of these 3 questions, Jesus said to Peter, "Feed my sheep." It's only after he has come face to face with his own woundedness and vulnerability that Peter can be entrusted with leadership. Then after this, Jesus says to Peter, "When you were younger, you used to fasten your own belt and go wherever you wished. But when you grow old, you will stretch out your hands, and someone else will fasten a belt around you and take you where you do not wish to go." In essence, Jesus is describing Peter's baptism. We see this in the gospel today. The very word church comes from a Greek word, ekklesia, which is really 2 Greek words combined. Ek, which is a preposition meaning out of, and kaleo is a verb meaning to be called. So to be a member of the church is to be called out of. And what we are called out of is what our normal agenda would be if we weren't conscripted by our baptism and by the demands of discipleship. The best example of what baptism and consecration really mean is the example of having and raising children. Imagine a typical scenario. A young man and a young woman meet, they fall in love, they get married. At this stage of their lives, they're fairly immature. Their agenda is their own happiness. And notwithstanding that they are good-hearted and sincere, they're both still selfish with the natural self-centeredness of youth. And then, without realizing the implications of this for their lives, they begin to have children. And what happens is that for the next 25 to, 50 years, every time they turn around, a number of tiny and not so tiny hands will be stretched out, demanding something of them. Their time, their energy, their money, their car keys, their understanding, their hearts. And whether they want to or not, they will mature. For 25 to 50 years, they'll be forced by a clear conscription to think of others before themselves. All these years of practice will eventually pay dividends. Normally, by the time their children are grown, parents are mature. Instead of their normal agenda, they're conscriptively asked to make sacrifices in lifestyle, hobbies, meals out, vacations, and so on. Their children stand before them every day, just like Peter before Jesus asking, "Do you love me?" And if the parents say yes, then biblically speaking, their children reply, "Until now, you have fastened your belt and walked wherever you wanted to. But now we're putting a rope around you and taking you where you would rather not go." Love is baptismal. Immediately upon confessing it, our freedom is derailed, and painful though it may be, we are taken by conscription into maturity. If we want freedom from being pulled around by the world, then we have to accept being bound and led by Christ. Yet this very binding might also prove to be the binding up of our wounds.